to honor agreements or face tougher measures. He spoke to SABC foreign editor Sophie Mokoena on the sidelines of the African Union summit taking place in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And she started by asking him about the role of the African Union in world peace and security. Here's how that conversation went down.
The AU is the most important partner of the United Nations. And we are now cooperating in a very intimate way in relation to both questions of peace and security, questions of development, and questions of governance and human rights. In the last 12 months, we've signed 2 landmark agreements of cooperation. One on exactly an enhanced coordination of our peace and security efforts, and now when aligning the Agenda 2030, the Universal Agenda 2030, to the African Agenda 2063. And indeed, if you look at what has happened recently, the UN totally supports the African Union in its mediation in Central African Republic. At the same time, I myself was very strong in asking the Security Council to support the G5 Sahel and to give them a strong mandate and predictable resources. Unfortunately, the Security Council did not go as far as I would like. But I believe in African troops doing peace enforcing and counterterrorism operations, but with a solid support of the international community, with mandates given by the Security Council and with resources, even mandatory resources, through assessed contributions. On the other hand, if one looks at the development side, we are totally committed to what is the main Africa concern. If one looks at the Sustainable Development Goals, we are making progress in those that come from the past, from the Millennium Development Goals, in education, in health, but in industrialization, in the environment, in infrastructure, in water, in energy. We are not yet making sufficient efforts. And these are the areas that are vital for the African development. And what we want is exactly to put all the UN economic development group system to support African states, here also with our Economic Commission for Africa, to support African states in order to be able to have a quantum leap in their development process. It is my opinion that the Agenda 2030 or the Agenda 2063 will only be successful if Africa development is successful. And for Africa development to be successful, we need to mobilize the international community in solidarity and, I would say, making justice to Africa. I give you an example. There are many requests, and I agree with those requests, that there should be good governance. There is here in the African Union today the proclamation of a year against corruption, about the need of fiscal reforms. But it is also important that the international community creates the mechanisms to fight tax evasion, money laundering, and illicit flows of capital that are taking out of Africa more money than the money that comes into Africa in development aid. Which means there is a lot of things that need to be done to be fair, to be just. Because if we have a fair globalization, Africa will have much more chances to develop its economy and to improve the welfare of its people.
When you look at the issue of development, poverty and hunger are critical. Do you think there's a political will, particularly from the African leaders, to deal with these challenges?
Well, like in any continent in the world, we have leaders more committed to the solution of these kind of problems, leaders less committed. But I must tell you, we found a very good cooperation in the African Union, the different regional organizations, in all our efforts in the fight against hunger that could have been dramatic last year. There was indeed a very strong African committee on that. And in the eradication of poverty, it's a global problem. It's not an African problem. It's a global problem. In the eradication of poverty, there I would say we need to do much more. And leaders need to assume much more, that it's not enough to have GDP growth, to have the economy growing. It's necessary to make sure that that economic growth, that prosperity trickles down and benefit the most vulnerable people, the rural communities, those that are in the slums of cities, because if not, you can have, it's like if one person has a cow and another person has nothing, it's as if in statistics there is half a cow for each. What the problem we have is that as important as develop an economy is to make sure that development is fairly distributed by the through the population of the country.
You spoke about peace and security. Currently, there are still pockets of conflict on the continent, particularly South Sudan.
That there must be African leadership to the solution of this African problem, and the UN must be in support. Second, that the decisions that were taken by IGAD in relation to the so-called high-level revitalization program for the peace agreement and for the cessation of hostilities, the respect of international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians, the access for humanitarian aid, that all these agreements need to be implemented. And also, the three organizations show the clear determination that if some refuse to implement what they agreed to do, and if some go on committing the kind of crimes that we still witness, then there must be concrete actions to punish it. And I felt that there was a total equal commitment of the three organizations, and that made me very happy, because Africans assume the leadership and we are ready to support.
But the leaders in South Sudan continue to violate the agreement.
That is why it's necessary to make sure, first of all, that there is enough pressure to avoid it, and if necessary, to adopt tougher measures to make sure that there is compliance.
Do you think we will be able to resolve the conflict in the DRC and perhaps look at the leadership?
What I found positive was the commitment both of SADC and of the African Union to fully cooperate, and there will be common initiatives in order to make sure that the elections take place as scheduled, and a common view that it is necessary to have in the DRC human rights respected, to have, of course, manifestations that should not be violent, but also that the authorities should also not use excessive violence, and especially the attacks on holy places are totally unacceptable. We are doing everything we can in order to make sure that we are able, first of all, to spend well money. Money should not be wasted, but spending well the money, giving value for money, it's necessary to have the resources that are essential. In peacekeeping operations that unfortunately now are taking place where there is violence, where there are attacks to peacekeepers, we need to have a peacekeeping with more agility, more mobility, better intelligence, better equipment, better training. So we need to do an upgrade of our peacekeeping operations, and we are going to work with the troop contributing countries for that, and that was in the center of my discussions this morning with SADC about the Democratic Republic of Congo. But at the same time, there are situations where peacekeeping is not the way to do it. I mean, if you have terrorist organizations, if you have widespread conflict, then we might need peace enforcing missions to impose peace, counter-terrorism missions. And in those, I am totally in favor of African missions, but African missions with predictable support, financial support, and support in the mandates given by the international community. And I feel sometimes frustrated when I see there is not enough support to AMISOM in Somalia, or when I saw so much resistance to a much stronger commitment to support the G5 Sahel. I am a strong defender of the idea that in peace enforcing, in counterterrorism, the international community needs to rely on African forces, but giving them the instruments necessary for them to be able to deliver.
The continent itself, some are saying it's not ready to have intervention force.
Well, the continent is ready. The continent is ready for many things. The continent has proven to be the continent that has grown more economically for 10 years until very recently. This continent has fantastic success stories in economy, in governance. This is a continent of hope. And in some areas, yes, indeed, we need to give support to build capacity. But that's not only in Africa, that's everywhere. Capacity building is needed everywhere. The technologies are moving so quickly, so fast, that in all countries I've been, people recognize that there are things that need to be done. But I trust Africa in its capacity to mobilize its own resources, and the standby force that is slowly gaining ground, I believe, will be a very important instrument for Africa peace and security.
The issue of the UN reform, the continent has kind of made an appeal that they would like to see two countries being part of the permanent members of the Security Council.
There are different kinds of reforms. That is a central reform, the reform of the Security Council. And as I said many times, there will be no reform completed in the UN without the reform of the Security Council. And there I would say Africa is a double victim of colonialism. It is a victim of colonialism because of what it suffered with colonialism, but also because when the Security Council was created, practically very few African countries existed. And so the representation of Africa, not only in the UN, in most multilateral organizations, is not proportional to the reality of Africa. And so I think it's a very fair question to say that Africa should be represented with permanent members in the Security Council, and I hope that one day member states as a whole will be able to do that reform, because the African continent fully justifies a stronger voice in all international organizations.
Turning to the Korean Peninsula, tension there, is the world doing enough to assist and ensure that there's peace? We
believe that Security Council resolutions need to be implemented. We believe that we need to achieve the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But we believe that the unity of the Security Council is also creating an opportunity for diplomatic engagement. And we want a peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And the UN will do everything possible. I have already offered my own good offices. The UN will do everything possible for that goal to be achieved.